You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, coming to you from Maryland.
And Katie, you've just returned from a trip to Taiwan. How was that?
It was great. Taiwan is a really interesting place, and now is quite the time to be there.
Indeed. Taiwan was actually my last trip before COVID-19. I returned to the United States on March 10th, 2020. So I am looking forward to my next trip to Taipei. And certainly Taiwan is at the center of a lot of what we talk about on this podcast. So I hope that was a great trip for you. But Katie, it's that time of year again, i.e. November, which means a lot of summits around the world. And I'm not just talking about COP27, which just wrapped up in Egypt, but of course we've had, for the first time in a while, three major international summits take place in three different Southeast Asian states. We had the ASEAN summits hosted by Cambodia, the chair of ASEAN, wrapping up its chairmanship, the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali, Indonesia, right after that. And then finally, the APEC summit in Bangkok, Thailand. There has been a lot of in-person diplomacy happening in Southeast Asia after a long time. And I thought we'd give our listeners a little bit of our reflections on what exactly transpired. There's obviously a lot of ground to cover, and we won't get into the granularities of the various communiques. But I think we can maybe treat this more as just of an update for the various bits and pieces around all of these summits. I think maybe the obvious place to start is the elephant in the room, the unsurprising geopolitical cloud that looms over really any multilateral engagement at this point, which is Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, and that continued to cast a pall on these summits in the region, where certainly the United States and China's views on how they would approach the issue were being closely scrutinized. But of course, at the G20, that was a particular consideration for the host country, Indonesia, which loudly emphasized, including Prime Minister Joko Widodo, who said that, the G20 is not a political forum. Let's keep things neutral and not talk too much about the war. But of course, the third paragraph of the G20 communique is all about the war in Ukraine and its terrible effects. So, Katie, maybe just starting there, what sort of jumps out to you about all of these months later? How is Asia now coping with this war? What can we take away from these summits about the role that the Russo-Ukrainian war is having in the region?
Yeah, so I think at the onset of the war in Ukraine in February, I don't know that any of us really predicted, one, that it would go on as long as it has, two, that the Ukrainians would put up quite the fight that they've had, and for our readers and our listeners here at the Diplomat, that it would matter so much to Asia what was happening in Europe. And I think that's obvious from what happened at the G20. As our listeners will probably know, Russian President Vladimir Putin did not attend the G20. He dispatched Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov instead. And I think that was obviously done to save Putin from several upbraidings, possibly from other leaders in the G20 and in Asia, and kind of save him from potential embarrassment in those forums, especially given, as you noted, the third paragraph of the G20's communique after the summit focuses on Ukraine. It mentions directly the UN votes regarding Ukraine. It also, I think, interestingly notes that most countries, see, what's the exact quote? Most members
yeah,
strongly condemned the war in Ukraine. And so obviously that was done because Russia is a member, so Russia probably was not condemning itself. But the fact that that made it into the final statement, I think, indicates that nearly everyone else, if not everyone else, felt the same. Now, I know you had an interesting thought that we discussed in our pre-recording discussion regarding India's influence on that statement. So I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit more about how you think India influenced this statement and what that maybe says about India's shifting position on Ukraine, if it's shifting.
Yeah. So the first thing is, I don't think India's position is necessarily shifting. It's just interesting that it appears to be evidence of, India kind of taking the lead at the G20 on this particular line, which is, one of the things that Modi said at the SCO summit to Putin, which we talked about, which was sort of interpreted as India sort of criticizing Russia, although I think it was much more general than that and probably was overread by people that thought it was being overly critical of Russia. But, Modi said that, now must not be an era of war. It was something like that he said to Putin. And then the G20 statement, the sentence that appears is today's era must not be of war. And so it's just an interesting kind of parallel there between what Modi told Putin and then what shows up in the G20 statement. Amid a lot of scrutiny still, especially here in the United States, about India's sort of fence-sitting position on Russia's war, which is, of course, as we've talked about on this podcast before, due to a variety of reasons. The other thing that I think is interesting at these summits is Ukraine's role, right? Here I think we'll have to talk a little bit about the ASEAN summits, the East Asia summit, and the G20, because at the ASEAN summit, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, of course, was widely expected to speak. That didn't end up happening because of consensus being blocked, and the strong suspicion that I suspect is right is that Myanmar blocked consensus on this issue, because Myanmar is, of course, continues to be under, led by a military junta, which was, of course, one of the primary issues that came up at this ASEAN summit more generally. But Myanmar didn't want to give Zelensky a platform at the ASEAN summit, despite Cambodia, which. Our colleague Sebastian Strangio at The Diplomat wrote a good article about sort of Cambodia's kind of position on Ukraine, which is very interesting. Like, given Cambodia's history, the Cambodians actually empathize quite a bit with Ukraine, despite the fact that Cambodia is quite close to China, which of course is much more supportive of Russia. So the geopolitics here, I think, were quite interesting in the ASEAN context. But then Zelensky did actually address the G20, right? He made sort of references to the G19, explicitly excluding Russia. But what's interesting too here is that I think this G20 summit, and I think many commentators have made this point, is that it's the first G20 the first G20 leaders meeting that is taking place under these particularly difficult conditions of great power discord, which raises a question more generally: is that can an organization like the G20 continue to be useful under the current geopolitical environment where great powers do disagree? And I actually think that this summit outcome, the fact that the communique was able to include a paragraph on the war, even if there were varieties of views within the G20 on Russia's war, I think it's a positive sign. I mean, there's no shortage of global challenges that the G20 was, of course, set up to address still. So I'm wondering what your view on that is, Katie. Do you agree, or do you think that's potentially not what we should be taking away from this?
I think I would broadly agree. I think there's certainly space within the G20, as in any international forum, for some level of disagreement. Now, how long that can continue before it ruptures is unclear. I think maybe the example of the G7, which used to be the G8, is maybe an example worth looking at. Russia was kicked out, removed, is no longer in the G7, 8, and so I think, within the context of the G20, which is nominally the 20 largest economies, it's not technically the 20 largest economies. That shifts year to year, and the G20 remains pretty stagnant in terms of membership. That you could foresee a future in which Russia is pushed out, but I think we're nowhere near that precipice. I think many leaders within the G20 certainly see the value of engaging. And obviously this year's return to in-person diplomacy is seen very favorably by these leaders. And I think this gives us, certainly as commentators, much more to work with and much more to look at in terms of engagements. Certainly some of the side encounters, and I'm thinking specifically here about the Trudeau-Xi encounter, tell us things about relations between these states that we can't get from not having these meetings. And so, if nothing else, a large forum like this that isn't as massive as, say, the United Nations, still fairly a small group, gives room for all of those countries to engage with each other on some of these touchy issues, either officially up front or at least on the sidelines. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the value of this continues, even if there is some awkwardness. In that same statement, the G20 mentions Ukraine, but also says, this is not a security forum. So it's sort of a this isn't the place to solve this, but we need to acknowledge that it's happening. And I think that's obviously because of the massive impact it's had on global economies. Talk about, global food security in Ukraine. Those are pretty prominent issues across Asia. So I think there was no avenue to avoiding it, and they sort of found a diplomatic way to include it. The Russians are obviously not particularly happy with that, but I don't know that they get a say in terms of whether that's included or not.
Yep. No, I think that all sounds right. I mean, on the issue of membership in organizations, we should mention for listeners that we're going to have to start getting used to calling ASEAN an 11-member bloc, because ASEAN did agree in principle finally to admit Timor-Leste as the 11th member of the bloc, which has been an issue that's been pending for a long time, since I believe 2011 was when Timor-Leste originally applied after gaining independence in 2002. It marks the first new member in ASEAN since Cambodia joined in 1999, and so that's I think an important benchmark to sort of point that out. I mean, briefly before we move on to talking about the Biden-Xi summit, which I think we will have to talk about a little bit at least. I think it's just worth noting that the ASEAN summit, I mean, the issue of Myanmar is still obviously looming really large over ASEAN, and there's a variety of views. The sort of 5-point consensus has really gone nowhere, and ASEAN can't even get around to agreeing on whether or not Myanmar's participation in the group should be suspended or not. And so, unfortunately, for those of our listeners who are tracking the still very dire situation in Myanmar, there's really no progress, no meaningful progress to be reported out of the ASEAN summit. So that's just, unfortunate. But Katie, I mean, going back to the virtues of in-person diplomacy, I think it's fair to say that the first in-person meeting between Biden and Xi went pretty well. If you're somebody that likes to see the leaders of the United States and China actually have a somewhat productive discussion, I mean, it certainly casts, it certainly can be juxtaposed with the, that meeting that took place in Alaska way back when at the start of the Biden administration, where we had a little bit of a shouting match. And so, some people have called this a reset in the U.S.-China relationship. I don't think I would go that far. But I think it is showing that, these two leaders who, of course, when Xi, before Xi became president, when he was effectively vice president, of course, when Biden was vice president, Xi and Biden have known each other for a while, and now they're, of course, leading their respective countries. So having this opportunity to meet in person was, I think, a good opportunity. It went better than it could have. It also, I think, indicates that some of the U.S.-China tension that had built up after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August has now sort of, if not fully dissipated, at least dissipated enough that the U.S.-China relationship can be somewhat back on the rails. Going back to that, going back to the guardrails that the Biden administration has been talking about. So overall, I thought like the readout suggested that the ship has been righted for the moment. Certainly, there's no shortage of divergences between the two countries and disagreements, but I think both Biden and Xi were able to show the region that their differences weren't necessarily going to steamroll everything else that's happening in Asia, which has been a frequent concern in the region, that great power competition between the United States and China will subsume everything else in Asia. And the other thing that a lot of people have, of course, pointed out is that Biden apparently got Xi to agree to reiterate the statement that China signed on to back in January this year, that a nuclear war should never be fought and can never be won, which did not appear in the Chinese diplomatic readout of the meeting, but the White House did talk that up, which, on balance strikes me as, again, another positive development. But I'm wondering, what were your impressions of that meeting between Biden and Xi?
Yeah, I mean, nothing in the meeting readouts or the remarks really offers any radical departures from the kind of current tense but stable trajectory. It's somewhere short of conflict, but it's not really close enough to cooperation. In the U.S. readout, Biden, emphasized the competition, not conflict trope, which pops up a lot in U.S. talking points regarding China these days, and emphasized collective action on transnational issues like climate change. But at the same time, Biden reiterated U.S. policies regarding Xinjiang, which is condemnation, and Taiwan, which is a preference for the quote unquote status quo. And so, the fact that these were mentioned in the meeting sort of went along in an expected fashion for diplomatic engagements, I think is a positive sign. Now, it's not a huge leap forward. I think there's a lot of points of tension and difference between the U.S. and China that remain unresolved, just because the United States and China have such different ways of viewing the world at this point. And obviously, having just returned from Taiwan, Taiwan is a major point of that. But I think I would agree with you that some of that tension that had certainly ratcheted up after Pelosi's visit has dissipated to a degree, that we've sort of returned, at least between the U.S. and China, to that status quo. And so hopefully there can be more improvements from there. But like I said, there's an awful lot to get through.
Yeah, and of course, these meetings were happening after the midterms in the United States and the 20th Party Congress in China. So she sort of returning, obviously it's really interesting to see, Xi Jinping without a mask meeting all of these international leaders in a summit setting, right? That's something we haven't seen in a number of years now. So you sort of have this, Xi newly confident, having sort of sealed in his third term and his status as leader for life, effectively going overseas and pursuing China's goals. And I think here's where, Xi's messaging to the region, again, is important to emphasize, right? I mean, we saw all of the classic, PRC talking points on helping Asia grow on Asia's own terms, China contributing to the region's successes. And I think, Katie, this might be a good segue actually to sort of close out our conversation today by talking about the final of these many summits that just took place in the region, which is the APEC summit, where Xi actually was supposed to give a speech in person, but then he couldn't do that. And then basically, his written speech was sort of given out. But I'm wondering if you want to sort of just wrap up for our listeners what the big takeaways are from the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting in Bangkok.
Yeah, so the theme that Thailand had set out for the summit, I think, is really important to keep in mind when looking at the ultimate leader's sort of statement after that. It was open, connect, and balance. The APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, has 21 member economies in the Pacific Rim countries. So all these countries border the Pacific. They use the term economy as opposed to member, which is why entities like Taiwan are economies within APEC, even though they're not recognized as members of, say, the UN or something like that. And so it's interesting to watch Taiwan at these forums, because Taiwan generally doesn't get to engage in a lot of multilateral forums because of China's opposition. But it's been a member economy of APEC. And so, those three sort of themes that Thailand set out really were focused on, promoting trade and investments open to all, reconnecting the region, particularly after COVID-19, and then sort of pushing towards balanced, inclusive, and sustainable growth. And I think these are themes that we've seen again and again and again in a lot of international forums, but were highlighted once again. Like the G20, the APEC's ministerial joint statement, where the leaders' consensus after the meeting included a paragraph on Ukraine that was very close to the one that was included in the G20 statement, kept that same language that, APEC is not really where we're going to resolve security issues, but we recognize the impact of this on global economies, and that most of our members condemn this war. And so I think coming away from APEC, is a similar conclusions to the G20. Maybe some interesting side notes related to the APEC conference. The United States is the next host of APEC, so that'll take place in San Francisco next year. And so the United States, which sent Vice President Kamala Harris to the summit, Joe Biden returned to the United States, I believe, to attend the wedding of his granddaughter, which, I saw some commentary that Asia was going to take this as an insult that he left. I mean, I don't know about that, but Kamala Harris was there and sort of, laid out what the United States intends to hopes to do with its hosting of APEC next year. And then again, that focused on those ideas of sustainable growth. The U.S. mentioned decarbonization. So I think we should see more engagement from the United States on those issues with Asia. And then I think, again, just to bring up Taiwan, because I was there recently, the Taiwanese representative at APEC was Morris Chung, who was the founder of TSMC. He's no longer the chairman, but he's the founder. He's been Taiwan's representative to the conference since 2018. He apparently had a conversation with Xi Jinping, categorized it as pleasant. And so I think that's might be another sort of interesting note in that hoped for sort of de-escalation of tensions in the Taiwan Strait. That's certainly what the Taiwanese would prefer. So I thought that was an interesting outcome. Do you have any sort of thoughts on the APEC conference?
No, I mean none beyond what I sort of set out at the outset on Xi Jinping's remarks on sort of the traditional themes that China has pursued. It's interesting to sort of see that continuity despite the economic and geopolitical changes that have transpired due to the Russo-Ukrainian war and the COVID-19 pandemic. But Katie, I think we certainly ran through a gauntlet on all of these summits here. There's a lot of ground to cover. We didn't really even get into things like the United States and ASEAN declaring a comprehensive strategic partnership, which is sort of set out in a joint statement. There's nothing Asia loves more than comprehensive strategic partnerships, and so now the United States and ASEAN have one. But we will be obviously back to talk about a lot of this stuff in hopefully greater detail on future episodes of the podcast. But it's hard to believe that 2022 is almost at a close. We're almost here in December. For our American listeners, I hope everybody has a happy Thanksgiving. And for our Asian listeners and everybody else, we will be back soon with more. Katie, thanks for fighting the jet lag and joining me today to talk about all of these summits in Asia. It's always great to join you.
It is always a pleasure, and I'll just say that I until now didn't bring up that there was a EU Central Asia summit also last week. So many summits, so little time. It was a pleasure.
Everybody's happy to be back doing diplomacy in person. But on that note, make sure you subscribe to the Asia Geopolitics podcast so you can keep up with future episodes. And if you've been subscribed for a while, please do leave us a review. That really helps the show out. You can do that wherever you get your podcast, and we appreciate it equally. And with that said, thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.